and welcome back to the Ghoul Guide Association. I am Lauren.
And I'm Mary.
And we are, of course, your Ghoul Guides. And today we are doing a review. And we're reviewing something that I sort of promised at the end of our last reading recommendations episode. We are going to be reviewing R.F. Kuang's latest novel, Katabasis, or Katabasis, because I have since found out that I have been saying it wrong the entire time, which is a bit embarrassing because Katabasis is the journey to hell. It means, to go under, to go to hell. So it's actually a word that I have had cause to say before in my life when I have been teaching undergraduates.
It's difficult though. And I think, I'm sure that we have lots of readers that listen to us, and I'm sure that everyone has that thing where you read a word and you pronounce it in your head a certain way, and then when you speak it, you then suddenly realize that you've been pronouncing it wrong. But I think we're all here to learn and to grow, and I think it just shows that you're someone who reads a lot, but also you recognize that a pronunciation is wrong and you course correct. That's all we can do.
Only human. And to be fair, at an interview, R.F. Kuang herself said, I don't mind if you say Katabasis or Katabasis, which I appreciate. However, I will say it is a real Greek word. So it does literally have a correct and incorrect pronunciation. And the correct pronunciation, I believe, is Katabasis, or I think it's almost like Katabasis, because it is a real ancient Greek into contemporary Greek word that means to go to hell, which, if you are familiar, you might know includes myths such as the Orpheus and Eurydice myth, which is an ancient Greek myth in which the bard and poet Orpheus loses his lover Eurydice, partially because he's not paying her enough attention, because he's too obsessed with trying to write the perfect song. And he goes down into hell to make a deal with Hades and tries to convince Hades to let him take Eurydice back. And Hades says, you can take her back as long as you don't turn around. And as they reach the exit, Orpheus turns around and Eurydice is trapped in hell. It is very, very famous. I mentioned last time that one of my favorite musicals is Hadestown, and that's what that myth is based on. Katabasis would also apply to something like Dante's Inferno, one of the greatest pieces of fan fiction of all time. Mary, do you want to describe Dante's Inferno at all? Because I'll be talking a lot in this one.
I mean, Dante's Inferno is his Divine Comedy is written by Dante Alighieri. I forget.
Yeah, I think it's
pronunciations. Alighieri, Dante, and it consists of 3 texts, one of which is the Inferno, and that is about hell. It's where we have the circles of hell. He comes up with that concept. And as he has his character journeying into the circles of hell, he obviously puts in people that are evil or just his, own poet nemesis. So I think that it's really funny when you read it to be like, oh yeah, I see why that guy's there. But then it's like, this guy's really random. And you look up who it is and it's just someone who was also alive at the time.
It's just someone that Dante hated.
Dante hated. Which I guess that's my main takeaway of Dante's Inferno. Just, where you can hold a grudge so much that you write in someone to live eternally in hell in this book. But yeah, I guess it is also about the whole journey into hell and the circles of hell.
Yeah. So Katabasis or Katabasis, I will try to say it properly, but 30-something years of saying it wrong are going to catch up with me. So Katabasis is R.F. Kuang's latest novel. If you are not familiar with her and her work, she came onto the scene a few years ago with her trilogy, The Poppy Wars, which is a historical fantasy set and centered around the Opium Wars between China and the British Empire. They are a really fantastic series, famous amongst readers for having an absolutely brutally, devastatingly sad ending. She is very good at that. But what she's always been really interested in as a writer is these narratives around colonialism, colonial identity, very anti-colonial. And she herself is an academic. So she has been to 3 of the most prestigious institutions in the world, Cambridge, Oxford, and Yale. And she is currently, I believe, getting her PhD alongside being a published author. So after the Poppy Wars, she moved into more standalone fiction. So her fourth novel, the standalone Babel, which I recommended recently, is I won't go into it too much because I explained it there, but essentially it is often referred to as dark academia, and we will talk a little bit about this idea of dark academia. I know we've touched on it before, but we'll talk about it a little bit again. And it's essentially a fantasy version of Oxford and the School of Language, and it is quite a chunky novel. This one is also quite chunky, but I've just realised when I picked it up off my shelf that Babel is actually a bit bigger. But yeah, it's set in the late 19th century. So I personally really enjoyed it. And then that was followed up by something completely different, a novel called Yellowface, which I devoured Yellowface. I read it so quickly. I actually picked it up. You know when bookshops sometimes accidentally put books out too early? I was in a Waterstones near Soho, and I was like, oh, I'll just go and have a look what's out. And I saw it on the table and I was like, that doesn't come out until like next week, because I'd got it like in my calendar when it was going to come out. So I bought it, and I felt like I'd committed some kind of like great escape.
Yeah,
I was like, I've got Yellowface a week before. But that novel is it's about a white author who is struggling to break into the scene, and she is good friends with a Chinese American author who is like the darling of the scene. And essentially, not to spoil anything, because it happens right at the beginning, in Yellowface, what happens is Athena, the Chinese American author, dies. And June, the white author, is in the apartment when this happens. And she basically steals Athena's last novel, rewrites it and publishes it as her own, hence the title Yellowface. It is a very uncomfortable analysis, not only of white feminism and white authorship, but also of token BIPOC authors, of who has the right to tell a story of trauma. So one of the narratives is that Athena has never lived in China. She has no knowledge of being a rural Chinese peasant, but she's made her career writing these novels. And in some way, Yellowface is also about R.F. Kuang poking fun at herself as well as her contemporaries. And then her most recent novel is Katabasis. So before I move on to what this novel is about, just a quick word about R.F. Kuang herself. Now, there's been a lot of back and forth since this novel came out last month about her as a writer. And a lot of people felt, particularly when Babel came out, and I think I mentioned this last time, that Kuang talks down to her audience and that she over-explains things and that she assumes her audience and her readership is stupid and she over-labors the point. Now, I personally never got that. And I don't know if that's maybe because it could be because I'm dumb. It could be because I'm comfortable in my own intelligence. Who's to say? I do think, as with all authors, it's entirely possible that she's just not for you. If that's not your style, that's not your style. I fucking hate Dickens because I find Dickens to be over-explanatory, too wordy, too lengthy. I don't enjoy the prose. However, I can recognise that Dickens is an incredibly good writer, has a place in the literary canon, is genuinely accepted as a genius. I just really don't like his work. I've never managed to finish a Dickens novel. So I do just want to say at the beginning that I do not want to fall into this territory of if I don't like something, that means it is not good. And I think we've always tried to do that. We try to be critical of the art we love as well as the art we don't like. And I do just want to say at the beginning that I acknowledge, if you are on the book spaces of Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, you've probably seen this conversation. And I just want to say, I've seen it. I understand. I do think we are at a point in culture where we are struggling with this idea that if we don't like something, that doesn't have to mean it's bad. I personally don't think Kuang talks down to her audience, but I do also accept that as an academic, it's entirely possible that I don't feel that she's belittling because I don't see the problem, because I'm doing the same thing. And I will hold my hands up and say, I'm part of the same cult she is. Like, I too am part of the academy. I too am part of the English literature history space. I haven't been to Oxbridge, but I went to a prestigious Redbrick for my PhD. I have a fucking PhD in English literature. Like, that is really pretentious. So I will acknowledge that whilst I don't find her work pretentious, it's entirely possible that I don't find it pretentious because I'm also fucking pretentious. And I'm okay with that. Like, I'm okay with accepting that might be a flaw that I also have. And that's not to compare myself to the genius that is R.F. Kuang. But what I'm saying is I'm part of the same cult. Like, we're looking at things from a very similar perspective, in that we're both women with PhDs in this field.
I think that it is always really good to think about how, people have different tastes, and just because something isn't to your taste doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad, and just because something is to your taste doesn't mean that it's necessarily good, and that we can all have a conversation about things and discuss what we find interesting and what's unique or different or groundbreaking or not groundbreaking about a certain text, and then also have a discussion about how it fits in with our own tastes. So I think it's always worth considering.
Yeah, exactly. So on that note, what is this novel actually about? So just a quick up top, I will explain what the novel is about. We will then talk about some of the key themes, and just, obviously Mary hasn't read this, so there's a couple of things I just want to talk about, some of the key things. And because this is specifically a novel about academia, I think it's probably one that we both have some insights on. I will not spoil until the end. So if you have not read this novel and you want to read it, I will do my best to give you a good insight. We'll talk about some of the key themes. I will try not to spoil the ending until the end of this review. And I will say, if you don't want spoilers, cut off now. But what I will say is, if you
spoilers.
Yes, if you are the type of person that likes to go into something not knowing anything about it, listen to this next bit when I tell you what the novel is about, then go and read it, and then come back and listen to the discussion. I know we all have very different reading practices, and I think that every one of those is justified. So I just want to cater to our association and their needs. So that is going to be the structure of this episode. So Katabasis is a novel about two Cambridge PhD students, Alice Law, who is Chinese American, and Peter Murdoch, who is white British. They are studying under I will say famous/infamous, older, world-renowned academic. And this academic dies. They are in, I think it's their third year. So PhDs are ever so slightly different at Oxbridge. They're a little bit more formal. The way that we tend to do it in the rest of academia in the UK is you have a confirmation review in your first year where you pitch your project, and they go, yes, great. And then you work on that project for the next either 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, depending on if you're part-time or full-time. And then at the end of it, you submit your thesis, you have a viva, you either pass or you don't, or you pass or you get revisions, whatever it may be. It's a little bit more structured and a little bit more formal at Oxbridge because It's one of the oldest institutions and the most prestigious institutions. So there were a few things where I was like, why would that be an issue? And then I was like, oh yeah, this is not the institution you work at, Lauren. This is Oxbridge. So the concept of the novel is they're second year, 2 second-year PhD students, Alice and Peter. Their supervisor, their director of studies, has died. And they are like, how am I going to finish without a supervisor? Because they are studying analytical magic, which in the realm of the book is a little bit like a science. They work in a lab. So imagine you're a science PhD, you're working under another scientist, and that scientist who has designed all this stuff, who knows all this stuff, dies. You suddenly have no head of your lab, no project, no funding. They decide that they have sacrificed too much to their PhDs for it to go awry now. They cannot possibly viva without a supervisor, so they decide to go to hell to fetch their supervisor and bring him back so they can finish their PhDs.
My question would be like, is there like an assumption made that their supervisor will be in hell? Like, what? Like, or do they like first work out, right, firstly we need to find out where our supervisor is and then we'll go there? Like, how do they you know, why do they just immediately go to hell? Or is it that like this supervisor is so infamous and notorious that this is the only place that they're gonna go? Like,
yeah, it's the former. We were quite blessed with our supervisors. I do think, you know, we have quite good relationships still with our supervisors. I personally really love my supervisors. I chose to study with them because I had heard they were nice people. However, so I should caveat, I now work in doctoral education. My job, my day job, is not my research. My day job is actually teaching PhD students how to be PhD students. So 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, my job is teaching PhD students how to do a good presentation, how to present themselves, how to build their profiles, how to do good research. And I would say a significant portion of my job is also dealing with the bullshit that supervisors put their PhD students through. The supervisor in this novel, Professor Grimes, is your classic piece of shit male academic. There is no question that this man is in hell.
Okay.
So essentially, the world of this novel exists kind of like Babel. So in the same way that Babel had this idea that you could create magic through language and linguistics and interconnections between language around the world, in Babel, it was very language-based. In Katabasis, magic essentially is kind of like a combination of logic and alchemy.
Okay.
So logicians and so this is where it does, and I can see, I'll say straight away, this is one thing where straight away I thought this could be a massive turn-off. And you could definitely start reading this novel and think, what intellectual wank is this? Because the magic system is essentially derived from like mathematics, logic, and philosophy. So the magicians are people like Plato and Aristotle and Dante and Orpheus, essentially. So the way that they do magic is by doing calculations and by drawing pentagrams and by making, so it's very similar to, I would say, alchemy and the idea of alchemy. It is a science of itself. So they call it analytical magic with a K. And one of the things about it is like straight away, Alice uses one brand of chalk and Peter uses a different brand of chalk.
Yeah, like, and I mean, there's a reason why a thing in alchemy is you know, the philosopher's stone, because it's all about like the philosopher, and alchemy as a branch of philosophy, which was then kind of, you know, this was before we had 3 distinct branches of science.
Yeah.
Alchemy wasn't necessarily outside of that. It just hadn't been proved. But there were people who were philosophers who also did physics and maths and chemistry. But there, that wasn't a kind of distinguished thing. But you could be a philosopher and then
Yes.
be trying to do all this experimentation.
Yes,
So
essentially. So I'll talk a little bit.
It makes sense to me.
It does,
I guess,
yes.
kind of.
It does. I feel like it makes sense a lot within the world. So I'll talk about that a little bit in a second, because that's one of the things I want to chat to you about. So essentially, we have Alice and Peter. Alice and Peter are both Professor Grimes' students. And as we realize very early on, as we have seen time and time again, Alice and Peter have been used by their supervisor to create a false sense of competition between them to make each of them work harder. So Grimes has been telling Alice about how amazing Peter is, and then telling Peter about how amazing Alice is. I will say up top that if you have done a PhD, particularly in Britain, this novel is potentially incredibly triggering. There were quite a few moments early on where I was like, oh no. And I think particularly, my PhD experience, we had some traumas. Mine were mostly actually to do with that competition with other students. Fortunately, I had you. And instead of being in competition with each other, we decided to band together and become inseparable.
I was gonna say, I just
oh my God, are we Alison and Dave and together?
I just can't. I just can't. I anything that involves any kind of competition, I'm just like, I'm uninterested in that. So
yeah, and I will say it's very different in our field. So one of the things that I thought was really good here is it leans more into the sciences, because science academia is quite different. You are competing because only one person can make a discovery, really. Even if two people make a discovery at the same time, if you're slower to publish than the other person, and it is a very different field. We, as literary historians, we're researching something that happened like 200-300 years ago. Yes, we are in competition with other people, but it's often very rare that we're likely to make a discovery. Archaeology is a little bit different, and like paleontology, maybe geography, but for the most part, we aren't working with, we're working with theoreticals and concepts. They're working with discovery. So she links it more closely to this science, and logic is actually a field of academia. It's a field of academia I don't really understand. Logicians are on an absolute another level. They sit between the sciences and the humanities, and they are at once scientists and mathematicians and philosophers and like social scientists. I don't know how they do it. They have bigger brains than I do. But essentially, what it is imagining is magic replaces what we would think of as logic in this field. So the novel starts out, Alice, as she tells us right at the beginning, thinks that she has killed Professor Grimes. So the book opens and she's like, I have to go to hell because I sacrificed so much to come and do this PhD with him. He is the only person I can do this PhD with. I am here from America. Like, it has to be him. She feels a lot of pressure as being not only an American, but we assume a Chinese American. She's come from a different system. She's at Cambridge, and she's like, I cannot lose this now. I have to have this guy as my advisor. So she is going to hell to bring him back because she feels guilty because she thinks she killed him. But also because she is like, I can't possibly finish my PhD without him. I've given up too much. And as she's drawing her pentagrams, she's getting ready. She's been doing all this research. She's been reading. So in the world of Katabasis, Orpheus, Dante, T.S. Eliot have all been to hell and come back. And the idea is that actually there's very few people that have done this, and it's quite difficult to know. And there's a lot of debate about like the different types of circles from hell. Alice is also leaning into a lot of Chinese mythology about hell, and the idea is they all sort of appear to be, it's like, essentially, Dante's version of hell is Dante's version of hell because it's Dante's personal hell.
Interesting.
And
Yeah,
then
yeah.
so it's like it's going to depict itself in a certain way based on the person that is experiencing it, essentially. So she's done all this research, she's drawing her pentagram, and as she's about to just close the pentagram, Peter appears and is like, I'm coming with you. And you realize that he also had been planning to go to hell. And as the novel progresses, so first of all, they find themselves, how do they get into hell? There's all of the shades waiting to get into hell. And it starts to then set up hell as a physical and ideological space. They're trying to figure out where in hell he might be. You've got some fun interplay between these different mythoses of hell. Are they is it a circle? Is it a plane, with different areas? Is it an Escher's staircase? What kind of paradox is it? And you've got this wonderful interplay between Greek mythology, Chinese mythology, Western logic, Alice in Wonderland. You've got that kind of Lewis Carroll mathematician aspect to it. And Alice and Peter are bickering over which of them might be right. And you get that kind of rivalry. And essentially, as they make their way through hell, you learn about their respective journeys, not only to the PhD, but on the PhD. Alice's experience as somewhat of an outsider at Cambridge, as a woman in an institution. I do feel like if you have particularly been a woman in academia, you will see where a lot of it is going. And you're almost like, oh, no. But in some ways, it's a very cathartic read like that. So essentially, the novel is Alice and Peter's descent into hell, searching for Professor Grimes. And as they go, they are forced into this self-exploration of why do we do academia? What does it mean to be an academic? What is and what should be the relationship between the PhD and the supervisor? And how, a little bit like Babel, exploring that tension that exists between colonialism, class, and elitism, and the passion and the desire and the very earnest, genuine thirst for knowledge. And particularly with Alice as a main character, we see how that can fundamentally warp a person, and how in this desperate pursuit of knowledge, we can sometimes forget why we started the journey in the first place. And that certainly rang very true for me. Halfway through my PhD, I had a big breakdown, was like, why am I doing this? What is the point? Does this even matter? I was miserable. I was in competition with people I didn't know. I was essentially in competition with people that I didn't realize I was competing with and didn't want to compete with. And I had to kind of re-find myself and my reasons for doing it. And that's essentially the journey that Alice goes on. So that's the overview of the novel. All right, so as I touched on, one of the big things in this novel is this idea of analytical magic. That analytical magic exists as a discipline, as a sort of science that blends logic, alchemy, philosophy. And I did really like this as a setup. And I really liked the way that it embodied the thrill and the desire that goes behind research. Alice talks a lot about this discovering magic, essentially. And I particularly found that really moving, because I can remember distinctly being an undergraduate. And even though I knew I loved literature and I loved history, realizing that there was this academic method, this academic school that looked at history and looked at literature, and particularly with the Gothic, that through combining these things, you could learn something, and you could learn something new, and just the thrill of that exploration. And I think because she didn't pick a real subject, because she made up a subject in analytical magic, I really felt like whether or not you were an art student, a scientist, a historian, a geographer, it was really easy for me to connect my research and my passion and my field to this idea of analytical magic, because it doesn't actually exist. So I really loved that she didn't make them, I don't know, you could do a system of magic that is different, and other systems of magic in other fantasies have used different things like poetry and things like that. Really appreciated that it was a blend of all of these things, because I felt like as a reader, who I think in a lot of ways is the target audience, because it's very specifically a novel about the experience of being a PhD student, I really loved the fact that I feel like any of us could read it and be able to connect to it. PhDs often are quite a divisive experience because it's difficult to bridge the gaps between the disciplines. So I feel like by making up a discipline, it meant that we could all connect to it a little bit better. And it wasn't the strongest in terms of like a magic system that you could translate. Maybe like the magic system in Babel felt very, I really understood how it worked. I'm not a linguist, so it's not that I just understood it more. It was a little bit more vague about what they could actually do, but I suppose it was more about the experience of the doing it. And then I realized that's kind of a metaphor for doing a PhD. So I just wanted to ask you, how do you feel about this idea of how do we represent the passion and the drive at the beginning, like for research? Because I felt like actually by having it as like a magic system that is at once infinite potential, but also has all of these rules and structures that you have to follow for it to work, I felt like that really captured the essence of what it is to do, because a PhD specifically has to be original research.
Yeah, I think we have talked both off air, but also in some of our previous episodes about, when we've mentioned dark academia. And I think I've tried it a couple of times and I've just not really, me personally, I find it really difficult to engage with. I don't know if maybe I need more distance between me and the PhD. There are lots of things that I enjoyed about the PhD, one of which, is meeting you and then, being able to still continue to have this, I think, really valuable, friendship that also we get to continue to explore our passions, and also engage with our research. So there's there are lots of things that I did enjoy about the PhD, and I'm glad that I did it. But I think, I don't know, I think a part of me is still like scarred by it, that I'm like, I just don't want to go back. And
I'm not ready to relive that.
I'm not ready to relive it. And I also think, even when we were doing it, because one of the reasons why I did a PhD was I didn't know what to do with my life. And I really enjoyed reading and researching and learning about new things. And I was like, this is a way for me to keep doing that. And there are lots of people I find that really kind of create a myth about doing a PhD, where some people that either want to do a PhD or that are doing one, and it's like you look at everything through these rose-tinted glasses and it's like, yes, I'm going to be drinking lots of coffee and reading poetry in these independent coffee shops, or I'm going to go outside, and then I'm going to have this really good relationship with like undergrad students, and I'm going to get really all this kind of stuff. And it's like, it's not exactly that. So maybe a story where it is essentially you get midway through and then you realize that the only way to get to the other end is to go into hell. Maybe that's quite an apt way to look at it. I think I think everyone's PhD journey is different, necessarily because you do have different supervisors. And there will be some supervisors who are more engaged than others, some who are just, not good and shouldn't really be supervising, and then some who are brilliant and amazing and really go out of their way to help you and to help you develop. And then there's lots of different people in between and all this kind of stuff. But some people don't really see a lot of their supervisors, and you really have to do something big to get their attention.
Yes.
And obviously it's also different in different disciplines. So yeah, like it sounds really interesting. And I do like the hell metaphor. I will say, I think that is genius.
Oh yes, and I will talk a little bit more about that in a moment, because there were so many moments I didn't want to underline this. I bought a beautiful hardback copy, and I was like, you can't underline this book. You can't underline this book. And I was like, but I want to.
Yeah.
But I think what I really appreciated here, and I think this is why we've had this conversation a little bit about dark academia, and I thought I'm going to bring it to the pod, because I said to you, I've been quite enjoying dark academia. And you said, oh, I really haven't. And I realized that the dark academia I've been reading is stuff like Bunny, which is about the experience of being in academia and the elitism of academia and the pressure to be brilliant and the myth. A big part of Katabasis is the myth they build around the supervisor. And slight spoiler here, cracked up laughing at how poignant it was, where they realize at one point that the supervisor hasn't done anything for 20 years.
Yeah.
That all he's done is put his name on his students' work, and that he's been riding on this idea of his own brilliance. And I was like, oh my God, that is such a big issue in the academic world.
Because luckily, you and I personally, we didn't have that experience with our supervisors. But
we know people that did.
We know people that did. And I think that, sometimes it happens. It happens in lots of disciplines, but I think that especially in something like the sciences, where you will have, the et al, where it will be the lead researcher who will, if you're working with grad students, it will be the supervisor, and then the et al will be the grad students, where I think, it's blurry as to how much, if anything, who is actually doing the work.
Especially with labs, the idea is like the head of the lab is therefore the owner of all the research. And there was this moment where the novel breaks down the idea of this brilliance of this man, of this supervisor. And I was like, oh, that hits hard.
Yeah.
Like that hits really, really hard, because we almost had the opposite way around, where I knew my supervisor as this like lovely, supportive woman who listened to my ideas. And then I would go to conferences and people would be like, oh my God, that's your super. And they like revered her. And I was like, she's brilliant, but like, she's just a person. And but then I was doing that to other people's supervisors. And, I infamously had an experience with an academic I had never met but admired, met that academic. That academic was so horrible to me that she made me cry. And I then discovered that all of her PhD students hated her. And we do this in academia. We have these heroes who either are these very genuine, lovely people that don't realize they're being touted in this way. And it's you putting pressure on yourself unintentionally to be like this person, when the person doesn't even really, the person isn't that. That's not who they are. Or they drink their own Kool-Aid and they buy into their own bullshit and they become this monstrous version of themselves. So I did really, the dark of the dark academia in these novels, I've realized that I've been enjoying, is the gothic bullshit of academia. It isn't the campus. It isn't the secret society and the, it isn't actually that like the cloisters or the library or the, the trappings of what you would think would make a dark academic.
The aesthetics. Yeah.
Yes. And it's not about being an undergraduate. It's about the way that academia warps your passion for knowledge, and about the fact that you can, whoever you are and however earnest and genuine your passion for knowledge is, you find yourself being twisted by the machine. Like,
I mean,
you find yourself becoming a snob and all of that.
We literally, before we came on, we were just having a chat before, and I think we were both having a talk about how getting through the PhD, especially when you are doing one that is, you know, so literature heavy, you don't have time to do any reading, but also it's hard to find the joy in it. And I think that both you and I are now in a place where we are kind of rediscovering reading for joy. And I think that is something where, you know, doing a PhD is hard. It doesn't make you better than anyone else to have done it, but they are hard. And I think that for both of us, and I'm sure for a lot of people who have done a PhD, and especially a literature PhD, you get to the end and you're like, I haven't read a book for fun in months, if not years, and I never want to look at a book again. It does destroy a bit of you. And it sucks the fun out of something, which is surely the reason why the reason why we do a literature PhD in the first place is because we both love reading and we want to learn about books and authors.
One of the things I really loved was that one of the ways that the magic system is created and the magic works is on paradoxes. And obviously that's because paradoxes are logic problems. And the idea is that if you can use a paradox, you can create something that doesn't exist, because the paradox, two things can be true at once, essentially, type of thing. So they use paradoxes to create magic. And I was like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But then when I thought about it more deeply, I thought, but actually the PhD itself is paradox. The paradox is at the heart of it, where you do something because you love it and because you're passionate, or you do something because you don't know what you want to do, but you feel passionate. So Alice is, I would say, more like me, does it because she's super passionate. And she's like, this is what I want and I want to achieve. Peter is more like, he's always been very smart. His parents are professors. And he's like, well, I'm not sure what else to do, so I'm going to follow my passion. So I felt like we both had a bit of a representation there in our journeys to academia. But then I thought about it and I was like, yeah, the fact that the magic is the paradox is actually really like telling and poignant. So the magic of it all was one big thing. I did really like the magic system in this. I do think if you have not experienced academia, it wouldn't be as engaging or as interesting. I do feel like this novel does have quite a limited audience in that way. And I can acknowledge that it probably doesn't hit as hard if you don't have that experience, because I don't think it does a lot to help you understand that experience if you haven't already got it, which does make me laugh a little bit about this whole idea that she's hand-holding and she over-explains herself, because I do kind of feel like sometimes it's the opposite. But the other big thing about this was this idea that hell is a campus. And this is right at the beginning of the novel, and I sent our group chat a picture of this line that was like, hell is a university. And I was like, oh, oh shit. And I wrote in my notes, Katabasis is dark academia for traumatized early career researchers.
Yeah.
And I think the hell at the beginning, it falls off a little bit to the second part, but the first two stages of hell they come to are the strongest bit. I thought this was the way that they argue about what hell might be like, and they're trying to understand something that is inherently unknowable. They both acknowledge that hell shifts. They both acknowledge that hell has no real boundaries. They both are like, oh, well, hell, they know logically that hell presents differently, but then they cannot help but try to codify hell and put their own reason and understanding onto hell. And again, I was like, that is such a good use of hell as a metaphor and hell as an idea. Alice at some points is really annoying, But she's really annoying in that way where you're like, I think I would be exactly the same.
It's really it's really reminding me of Buffy. Where the main spoiler the main, like, the concept of the first 3 series of Buffy is the idea that high school is
hell.
It's hell. It's on a hellmouth, and it's, you know, it's something that you have to get through, and you have all these experiences that are really traumatic and horrifying and difficult. And then season 4, Buffy and the gang go to university, and then it's like, oh, like, this is also hell. So I think, yeah, like that metaphor, I think does really work there, especially because people do have different experiences. A lot of people, you know, really don't like school and university, and it's difficult in different ways. And I think that the idea of hell, and especially drawing on the different concepts of hell, so different kind of cultures and religious ideas, and even literary kind of figurations of hell, I think is really interesting. And it's something that I think does lend itself to academia and the university campus, in that, you know, there's lots of different ways to approach this and to address the hell that it inspires.
Yeah, absolutely. And right at the beginning, so Alice and Peter make it to hell, and they are trying to get into hell, essentially. And they come across the gates of hell, and there's all of these shades all waiting in line. And essentially what Kuang does really well is blend all these different ideas about things like rebirth. So this hell's idea is that you make your way through the different stages of hell, and then you drink the waters of Lethe, and you're reborn. So that there is like a continued cycle of souls. And some souls get stuck, some souls move on. One of the things that I really loved about it is it's really unclear if you actually have to pass the tests at each circle of hell, or if actually you could just walk up to the waters and be like, I'm ready, like, I want to give up. Because so in the first 2 levels of hell, essentially, like, the first one is, I think, Pride, and it is a university. And they describe it as like a mirror of Cambridge. And in the queue, basically, to get into the first layer of hell, they meet these shades. And some of them that they meet are a group of, I think it's undergraduates, who were killed in an explosion in their supervisor's lab. And they are talking to them because they're trying to find, they're like, which level of hell would he be in? Right? They're like, would he be in wrath? Would he, because, and essentially what you realize is that he has committed all 7 of the sins. So he could be in any of them.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's really interesting is both Alice and Peter are like, oh, well, he must be near the end because he's so smart and he's so brilliant. We have to be really fast because, of course, he's not going to get stuck. Of course, he's not going to get stuck. He's going to go really fast because he's so amazing and he's so brilliant that even hell would be like too, you know, he's too good for hell kind of thing. So they meet these undergraduates, and the undergraduates have this bit where basically, like, they're asking, like, have you seen this guy? And they're like, Professor Grimes. And they're like, oh, yeah, we're his PhD students. And they're like, you came here for a paper? You came to hell for your research? Like, they're like, surely it's not that deep. And I really enjoyed the fact that the hell of it all allows Kuang to indulge in what makes academia brilliant while also savagely poking fun at how overly serious and overly invested academics are about things that are really not that fucking important.
Yeah.
And that a lot of the pomp and the splendor and it has to be done this specific way, it's just full of shit. It's really not that important. I really liked the fact that they're like, you came here for him, can't you just get another supervisor? And they're like, obviously not, because he's so amazing. So yeah, the first layer of hell is essentially a university. And I think the first two layers do really well. You've got these like Oxford dons and Cambridge lads that are just, they cannot give up and move on. Like, they cannot get past their own brilliance and their own self-indulgence and move on to the next thing. And then one of the final layers that you get to is basically people bickering about, like, it almost feels like an academic board meeting. And I was like, yes, an academic board meeting is hell. That's very true. So yeah, the hell of it all, I think particularly in the first half of the novel, she does a really, really good job. And I do think it's a really clever, a really engaging idea of hell. And I think particularly the way that it forces Alice and Peter to look into their own selves. And again, not to spoil it, Alice does have an epiphany that's kind of brought on by this process of going through hell. And I do think, particularly the first half, it just really, I found it really cathartic, actually, reading it. There were a few moments where I stopped and I was like, oh no. Like,
I shall see.
Yeah, I'm in this photo and I don't like it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do think, like, I'm trying to think of other like, obviously you have quite a few references to these other Katabasis narratives and other representations of hell. But one of the things I really liked about it was the fact that hell is not, it's almost like hell is a torture if you make it so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, the rebirth of it all and the way it all blended it, like, on a sort of metaphysical, spiritual level, I also really liked that. I liked that hell wasn't all demons and torture. Like, there are some moments like that, but a lot of the people they encounter, there's this whole thing where, like, the first bit is a library, basically, and they're all trying to submit a thesis to be able to move on. And they're basically stuck in this perpetuity. They're never going to do it. And I was like, oh no, this is like when my supervisor was like, you have to hand it in to get the PhD. You can't just keep writing the PhD forever. Like, you actually have to finish. So I did also appreciate that. But yeah, just the way that it, like I say, especially in the first half, it really unpacks just the bullshit that is academia, but also then what it means to love academia whilst knowing it's bullshit. And I think Alice as a character, as frustrating as she is at some points, obviously I can't relate to the experience of being American, of being East Asian, like, I can't relate to that experience, but I can relate to the experience of coming into the academy from outside of the academy, of not coming from an upper class background, not coming from an academic background, not coming from a red brick, and walking into that society and being like, I don't know the rules.
Yeah.
And in not knowing the rules, almost accidentally becoming an enforcer of the rules and having to check yourself and having to be like, that's not who I want to be, and I really need to stop myself from going on that journey, because that's not a place I want to go to.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many times throughout my PhD journey where, like, I realized that there were all these rules in place, but that, like, it was like just everyone seemed to know them, but no one talked about them, and it was kind of like, oh wait, what?
So at this point of the review, it will get a little bit spoilery, because one of the things I'm going to reveal, you do find out, I would say, in the first third of the novel. So it's not a huge spoiler in that you could, know what I'm about to tell you, and it's not going to harm your enjoyment of the novel. But if you want to go in eyes closed, I would say this is the moment to pause and to come back after you've read it. Mary, if somebody offered you the chance to never forget anything, would you take it?
Well, I forget quite a lot of stuff. So I don't know, because would I find it useful to be able to remember everything when I barely can remember things in my, maybe. Maybe. I
Do
guess it
you
depends.
think there would be any downsides to being able to remember everything?
Well, you would always be able to remember all of your trauma and bad things, I guess.
Yeah. So one of the things that we learn about Alice is that in his research, Professor Grimes has been working on a modification, essentially, using analytical magic on a human being. And this is obviously, like, it's very taboo, it's not supposed to be done. What we learn is that Grimes came up with a concept that you could put a pentagram on a person, essentially tattoo the chalk into them, that would prevent them from being able to forget. And we learn this very early on when Alice accidentally steps into the River Lethe. Alice and Peter get attacked by some little bone creatures that become quite important later on in the novel, so I'm not going to talk about them too much, but essentially Alice accidentally sets foot into the Lethe. And you have this moment of horror because she's going to forget everything. And then we realize that she's not forgetting. And Alice, in her narrative, reveals to us that her supervisor tattooed her with a pentagram that would make it from that point on that she could never forget anything. And at first, I was like, okay, this is a metaphor for the way that our supervisors and the way that academics force ideologies and force ways of working onto younger scholars that irrevocably change them. And then we get trapped in this cycle. But I have to admit, for a moment, I was like, I'd do it though. I'd do it. If I could remember everything. I constantly get you've all listened to this podcast. If you're listening to this episode, I get the dates wrong all the time. I get names wrong. I get, facts wrong. And I will lie awake in bed thinking, oh my God, I said 156 instead of 256. I said it was this person instead of this person. I got the name of that thing wrong. The idea as a researcher and a scholar that I could remember everything. When I first read that in the novel, I was like, oh yeah, you know what? I would probably do that too. What a boon. And then I was like, she's introduced this very early on. Clearly, we're not supposed to think that's a good thing. What you basically realize is that Alice, in not being able to forget anything, cannot let things go. And Kuang introduces this idea that forgetting is a vital part of the human experience. That if you cannot forget the time you tripped over in front of people, the thing that you said at the work social and nobody laughed, the time you were lecturing and you realized you've got shirt on inside out, like all of those little parts of the human and daily experience that a lot of us do dwell on because we're all neurotic overthinkers. But essentially her concept, there's like a secondary concept throughout this novel, and it is about the idea of memory and the idea of memory and forgetting. And obviously, because Lethe is a big part of hell, so if you don't know, the Lethe is the river in lots of versions of hell that is supposed to be, you drink, the undead drink it and they forget all of their memories of their life, and they're able to either go into a peaceful afterlife or to be reborn, depending on if you're looking at Buddhism or Greek mythology, whatever it might be. One thing that I did find really powerful about this novel was this idea of memory and forgetting, because as an academic, I've had people say, so this is a slight tangent, but this. I've had people say to me before, oh, your memory's so good. You've got like a photographic memory, because I am in some ways very good I have the memory autism, not the amazing photographic memory autism, but I have pretty good memory for things I'm interested in. If I'm not interested, I will absolutely fucking forget. But I could tell you, like when we were on the PhD, I was very good at being like, oh, in this novel, this thing happens, and this thing happens, and in this year, this war happened, and because that happened, this happened. And because I was always told that that was a skill and that was a good thing, I developed this weird sort of, and I think this is why I get myself in such a tiz if I get things wrong on the podcast, because I have this like weird self-imposed expectation of myself where I have to have a good memory and I cannot get things wrong. And actually, that's not how life is supposed to be. That's not how brains are made. And this idea that to not be able to forget is torture, to be able to remember every single bit of your day and not be able to be like, let's stop thinking about that. Let's cast that down the river. Like, let the Lethe take it. The idea of not being able to forget actually by the end of the novel became such a horror for me. And it really made me stop and think, because at the beginning I was like, oh, I'd love that. I'd love that. That would be brilliant. Imagine how good I'd be at my job if I could remember everything. And then what you realize is that Alice has become this broken person and able to do her work and able to enjoy her work because she can't forget anything. And I think that was probably one of the strongest aspects, this idea of the pentagrammic memory and the way that memory is something that we know scientifically is fallible. It is not meant to be perfect. But we put this pressure on ourselves to be able to remember things and recite things on rote. And so much of schooling and academia is shifting back towards this memory game that is such a false representation of someone's intelligence, someone's imagination, someone's creativity, someone's potential. And yeah, this idea that if I actually could remember everything, it would destroy me. It really made me reassess how I think about memory and my own memories and my own recall. So I quite appreciated that. Thank you, RF Kuang, for giving me permission to forget things.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I mean, yeah, like I'm learning, especially more like this year, like more about like how my brain works and things. And like, I have always had a bad memory, but it's like what I'm learning is that like actually my memory is just selective. And it's like the things that I'm really into, I will remember. But then if it's almost like unconsciously my brain decides that something is unimportant and then it just immediately discards it. And sometimes I can't help that. And like, would it be nice to be able to like remember more things? Maybe. But would I want to remember everything? No, I don't think so.
No. Like, to live is to be cringe. And I need to be able to forget things, really. I mean, I realize as well, and I think the novel does a good job of exploring this, that one of the things that academics do is make their hyperfixation, make their special interest their career. That, I did this. I pursued something that I was obsessive about. I'm the same way about my favorite K-pop band and video games that I like. If I like something, I am overly invested in it. But I just essentially realized that academia was a way to be able to legitimize that. And I think the novel does quite a good job of exploring the fact that you can't make it your whole life, that it isn't enough to be a whole life, and that there should be more. And it doesn't make you a good scholar. It doesn't make you a good researcher. And that the people that we idolize and the people that we hold up actually either aren't real because they aren't prioritizing the work, or they aren't happy because they are also doing these like toxic things. So overall, I gave this novel a 3/3.5. Now, you might be thinking, you've just said it did all these great things. That seems quite low on a 1 to 5 scale. I will say, I never recommend anything that I've rated lower than a 3. So to me, a 3 is a good, strong read, and I would tell someone else to read a 3. I wouldn't say, oh my God, this is the best book in the world, you have to read it. But to me, like, if it's a 3, I've enjoyed it. I'm going to keep it on my shelf. I'm not going to sell it. Like, I might read it again.
You've just triggered a memory.
I wasn't blown away by it.
You've just triggered a memory in me, as we were talking about memories, about me in secondary school, high school, where we'd like, you'd have like, you'd go to the library and you'd take up books, and then you'd make a note of the books that you were reading, and you'd keep I guess this kind of diary, and then you'd write a little bit about the
your
books
reading
that
trail.
you read. Yeah, and then you'd give it a mark out of 10. And then I think one of my English teachers was like, you never give anything 10 out of 10. Like, you only ever got to 9. And then me, whatever, like, stupid person that I was like, well, yeah, because nothing's perfect. Just made sense to me at the time.
Yeah, like, I have got, I've got some stuff that is a 5 out of 5, but I have to have been like, oh my God, I love that so much. And I texted everybody and told them to read it, to give something a 5 out of 5. And generally, as long as it's above a 3, I'll recommend it, because I think that, to me, a 3 is good. If a film's got 3 out of 5 stars, I'm like, that's a good film.
Yeah.
4 out of stars, oh, that's a great film. 5 out of 5, that's like one of the greatest films of all time type thing. So I gave this a 3, maybe a 3.5. I do think a big part of my enjoyment of this novel was the way that it really unpacked the academia of it all. I'm not going to go over it. We've literally just spent like an hour talking about this. But I do think that if you have been in academia in any way, particularly at that higher level, whether or not it's working in research, whether or not it's doing a PhD, being a lab assistant or a research assistant or an associate, there is just, she gets it. She's done it. She's there. She's experienced it. There has been some criticism about the fact that, she is like from this elite background. Essentially, she's been to these elite universities. I do acknowledge that. We have had a lot of novels about being a working class person or an immigrant and going to these privileged institutions. I think it is okay to look at it from a different perspective, because one of the biggest issues with academia, this is literally what my job is about, is that we have this baked in system, this hidden curriculum that is just unnecessarily difficult, unnecessarily stubborn. It is punishing sometimes, and it puts these brilliant young people through the ringer, and it often produces either egomaniacs or broken, devastated people. And you get both of that in Katabasis. It really explores the way that, so there are 2 characters called the Crypt Keys, who I'm not going to talk about too much, because that's kind of one of the bigger elements of the book that I think is good to leave hidden. But they basically, their whole narrative is the fact that they were excluded from the prestige, that they were seen as being these radical outsiders, and the mainstream academia refused to acknowledge them, and what that can do and how that can hold things back. And the way that Alice and Peter in their individual experiences are twisted and shaped, and they lose their way. I do think from that element alone, it could have been a 5, because I haven't really read anything that has so accurately unpacked that experience and managed to be very critical of it, and been like, the academy is a colonial, white supremacist, elite institution. But that doesn't mean that what is at the heart of the academy, which is the passion for knowledge and learning and discovery, is a bad thing. It's just that we've encased it in these walls. And I found myself thinking, I am a snob. Like, I remember like going to Sheffield for the first time and some being like, oh, why don't we get one of the nice old buildings? Because in my head, when I did my PhD, I was going to sit in a beautiful old building, and it was going to be really like, really cinematic. But then I would talk to people at places like York who were in the beautiful old building. And they were like, we've got no central heating. We've got no phone signal. Like, actually even the kind of, my love for these old university buildings, like it really made me challenge that, for example. My biggest issue is that the overall narrative loses its way in the second half. It's not as strong as Babel or Yellowface. Those are very tight, very well-constructed narratives. I feel like they were really well planned out. They were really well thought out. The weight of the concept, like the plot sort of caves under the weight of the concept. The second half of the novel loses its way, and the ending felt a little bit forced. So spoilers here. This is the big spoiler where I'm going to talk about the ending and my feelings about the ending. I hope that's okay with you, Mary.
Go for it.
So Alice and Peter go down into hell. While they are down there, they meet two lots of major players. Elspeth, who was a PhD student of their professors, who ostensibly committed suicide because he was so awful. She is kind of living down there as this like marauder. And meeting her forces them both to really challenge themselves. And you realize, like Alice realizes that she has been negatively judging Elspeth for being unable to handle it, for not being strong enough. And I really appreciated that dynamic. You then also meet the Crypt Keys. So the Crypt Keys are these two magicians who were rejected by mainstream academia. They killed themselves on stage, essentially. And what we learn is they are in hell, and they have been preying on like people going into hell, like the journeyers, and using them to make themselves more and more and more powerful. So at first I was like, oh, okay, this is really great. The Elspeth and the Crypt Key narrative and this idea of this like war within hell, and Alice has to go up against them, and it really lost its way. By the end, I understood why Elspeth hadn't moved on. I didn't really fully feel like I understood why the Crypt Keys were the villains and why they were doing what they were doing. But it didn't quite have the pull of, say, the villain narrative in something like Babel, where you saw the colonial, like, evil of why people were doing the things that they were doing. So I really liked the Crypt Keys as a villain, but it really fell off for me at the end. There's this idea that they've been driven mad by power and blah, blah, blah. It kind of felt like a little bit of an afterthought. It didn't quite hit. It didn't quite get there. There is a whole section where Alice goes to this citadel that's one of the deeper layers of hell. And I liked the concept. That's the bit with like the academic board. But again, it just didn't really... There's this bit where basically she goes onto this rooftop and all these people have decided that they are just going to become like trees, that eventually hell will, like, that nothing is eternal. So if they just wait and don't make a decision and don't move on, that eventually something will happen. And maybe it's because I don't have a good enough grasp of that philosophy or that logic, but it all just didn't quite... The first half is so well structured, so well thought out. The concept is so strong. The second half, where like she meets Lord Yama, the king of hell, and the idea is that Lord Yama, Hades, Pluto, like they're all the same version, like he's all one person. And she faces Grimes. The bit where she faces him was very, like, the payoff was good. The things that he says to her and she says to him, I was like, yes. But the way that it resolves, the way the novel finds, Alice has her epiphany, they get back to Cambridge. There was just something about that second half of the plot where the narrative wasn't strong enough to convey me. The concept was, the narrative wasn't. And that's why I've rated it a 3/3.5. I would still recommend it. I would maybe wait until it comes out in paperback. I'm glad I bought it in hardback because I wanted to read it. I wanted to review it for you guys and not wait too long. You know, we've waited just long enough to give people time to read it. And, you know, if people accidentally hear a spoiler, it's not the end of the world. But it didn't have the same hit for me that Babel and Yellowface did. Like, I remember reading Babel and realizing what was going to happen and being like, I have to keep reading. Like, even though I know what's going to happen, and I was sad, and I was, you know, and maybe it's because Alice as a character, those characters that frustrate you because you can see yourself in them are difficult because they're hard to root for, but they're also hard to not root for. The Alice and Peter relationship, some people complain that Kuang never fully sees through a romance. I don't have an issue with that. I think that's very real, very human. But there were just elements in the second half where I had to kind of consciously convince myself to carry on reading. It was in no way a DNF. It wasn't difficult. The prose is beautiful. One of the things I did really appreciate about the prose is I really struggled to know when this was set. I was like, is this the 2020s? Is it the 1980s? Is it the 1990s? And you figure it out because Elspeth dates it. Elspeth died in a specific year. Alice says it was X amount of years before her and Peter got to Cambridge. So you know it's like the 80s, 90s. And I think that's quite good that it's pre-technology. But one of the things I did appreciate was that really conveys the staticness of academia. That sometimes you're like, what year is it? Like, and I did appreciate, I assume it was an intentional decision to not date it, because I think Babel is dated, and in Yellowface it's very clearly contemporary. She's got social media and things like that. So I did like that the prose was difficult to date. That sometimes you were like, oh, that feels incredibly modern, and then other times you were like, oh, wait, no, that feels like almost archaic, because that, particularly the older red brick institutions, that is very much the case. But yeah, just the plot and it's not that it has holes, it's more like it's already a long novel and there were maybe some things that didn't need to be there, or maybe some things that needed to be there a little bit more. So that is my review. I'm giving it a strong 3. Not my favourite of hers, but still a good novel. And I think I would almost be tempted to make all of my PhD students read those first few chapters. As I was reading it, there were genuinely some things where I was like, I think I might put that in my pedagogy. Like, it really made me think about my practice as like a doctoral educator, and it really made me think about the way that we nurture PhD students. And I was like, well, I don't do that. And I wrote in my notes, so I wrote, it's dark academia for traumatized ECRs. I think that's the strongest part. I really understood Alice, despite the fact she frustrates me. I really appreciate Andy and Angela now, for sure. Which are my supervisors. Because whilst I think one of the other strong things is that Grimes is a really good villain, Professor Grimes, because some of the things he does are so outrageous, but then an academic that's done it. Obviously not like pentagrammed a student, but like, I can think of so many people. I will say there is a trigger warning in this for sexual assault. Because again, like I said, I suspected from the beginning that might be an element to it. And at first I was like, I hope there is no sexual assault. And then I thought, no, one of the horrible realities of this institution is that female PhD students in particular are so at risk of sexual assault from particularly older male academics. And actually, if Kuang hadn't included that as part of Alice's story, it would actually be omitting a big part of what the problem is with the academy and the institution as it currently stands. So I find it weird to say, like, I'm glad that was included, because
it needed to be there.
yeah, I don't like narratives that shoehorn sexual assault in just to make a character traumatized or just to make someone villainous. But the way that he behaves, like, oh, yeah, made me very, very grateful for my supervisors, but also I did have to like calm down before I went back to work.
So I guess, yeah, it sounds like it's the kind of novel that if you are in academia, maybe a student, maybe doing a PhD, or maybe thinking about doing a PhD, or you've gone through the other side and you're post PhD, that it would be worth reading and enjoyable. Probably still maybe enjoyable if you haven't, but maybe not to the same extent. And yeah, so I think if someone is listening and looking for a next read, then this could be it.
Yeah, I think if you are coming to this expecting dark academia in the way that certain books have been marketed, and this isn't to say that dark academia books are bad. I think we've not enjoyed them for very specific reasons as to why I actually did enjoy this. I think if you're expecting dark academia in the kind of intrigue in a beautiful old-fashioned campus and there is obviously power dynamics and stuff, but like it's not a secret history style dark academia. It is the darkness that is academia. So for me, it's dark academia in the absolute truest sense. But I do think if you were told this was dark academia and you were coming to this with a certain generic expectation, it could be quite disappointing. I would be really interested to hear what everybody else thinks about it, particularly in terms of this idea of like the Kuang's intellectualism. I don't have an issue with it. I really enjoy it, but then I'm like, am I also part of the problem? Am I also a pretentious wanker that's like, oh, a logic puzzle?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a reference to, you know, like there's some jokes in this about Dante, and I was proper like, and then I like was like, oh, oh no.
Well, I think that's always a really nice kind of area to end on, which is if you have read Katabasis, then please do share your thoughts with us. We love hearing your thoughts on things that you've read. If you liked it, or if you have, you know, if you like bits of it, or especially if you read it after listening to Lauren's review, then do let us know as well, because that's always great.
Yes, if you read it and then you came and listened to the talking points, like come and let me know what your thoughts were.
And also if there's anything that you want us to review or talk about in other episodes, or if there's books that you want to point out to us, then yeah, get in touch as well. We love hearing your recommendations as well.
We do. And I've got some more recs on the horizon. We'll be doing a bit of a cult and corruption reading recommendation soon, so stay tuned for that one, as well as some more deep dives, some more so you don't like horror, and some stuff, of course, because we're approaching spooky season. It is,
yes, we are
literally 2 days before October as we record this, which makes me very, very happy. I was telling Mary that I'm about to do a deep clean so I can get my autumnal decor out. So maybe send us some pictures if you've got your pumpkins out. And of course, in the meantime, stay safe and stay spooky.
Stay safe and stay spooky.